Hello. I just want to explain a little bit about what I call the flow of the session. This explanation is more for people who would be practitioners of what I call therapeutic spiritual counseling than it is for those of you who would participate in it. However, it has relevance either way. As I've described many times before, there are essentially four types of spiritual architectures or mechanisms of the mind that our internal oppositions are shaped as. There is the chronic condition one keeps experiencing. There are moments of shock. There are stubbornly held protective attitudes. And there are the personas or identities, these substitute selves that we take on or become. Now, the moment of shock is extremely traumatic. It's what you find in anyone exhibiting or dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so the shock handling I use for that is a very necessary technique for anybody who is in a condition of post-traumatic stress syndrome. The chronic condition is having the same sort of narrative or storyline or feelings happening over and over again. And there are specific techniques for each of these, but the way it works in the flow of a session, where I have developed techniques for each of these four spiritual architectures to unravel an identity, to unravel a stubbornly held protective attitude, which is essentially a form of resistance to things we don't want to feel, and manifest as some sort of thought or attitude or idea, which essentially says, I'm not going there about something that the person is too fearful of having to feel. There are other words for that, such as defense mechanism is a good term for the stubbornly held protective attitude. And those of you who got indoctrinated into Scientology might be familiar with the phrase service facsimile or service fac, which is, I think, a very superficial understanding and explanation of what this is. It is something we use to say, I'm not going there about something we're too fearful of experiencing, and it's an attitude we take on that says, I'm not going to engage in that. It's to protect or defend us from what we don't want to feel, and it has great liabilities to it. And I have a procedure for resolving that, and I have procedures for resolving each of these things, the identities, the stubbornly held protective attitudes, the chronic conditions, and those moments of shock that stay with us and keep running in the background all the time. But here's where the flow of the session becomes important. If you're going to be a practitioner, then you must stay within the flow of the session. And what I mean by this is you can be in the middle of doing a procedure for helping a person to resolve an identity that they've been stuck in, that makes a person hold on to certain attitudes and behaviors, which of course are detrimental, because then you cannot be present, you cannot be genuine, you cannot be there if you're being a self, an identity, and so forth. It's really quite crippling. But anyway, in the process of doing that procedure, your mind can then present a stubbornly held protective attitude that says, I must maintain this identity. Or it can present a moment of shock for which taking on this identity has been used as sort of a solution so as not to experience that moment of shock, or to take on the identity of a shocked person, which really holds it in place. You don't want that. Any of these four spiritual architectures or mental mechanisms can emerge, can be present in whatever you're addressing. So again, if we're addressing an identity, well, a stubbornly held protective attitude of, I need to be this way to deal with this situation or these people, holding that identity in place. Well, then in order to resolve that identity, you've got to be in the flow of the session, in the flow of the participants' spiritual compass, which is now presenting this attitude, this stubbornly held protective attitude. It's presenting it for a reason. It's what's getting in the way of resolving the identity. So you need to remain fluid and flexible and not be worried or stuck in the fact that you're on step 6 of a procedure and you need to get on to step 7. No, that's not what's important. What's relevant is what's important. And what's relevant is addressing what the being is presenting, what their spiritual compass is providing, because that's being provided because this is the next door that needs to be opened to resolving what the person needs to resolve. So there can be quite a bit of jumping around sometimes. This is common and usual, that you will go from processing, say, an identity to a stubbornly held protective attitude to a moment of shock that is the actual cause for the person to be what they're trying to solve in holding on to the attitude or holding on to the identity. So in order for everything to work out, to help the person, you got to stay with what that person's spiritual compass is so fortunately and generously presenting. Always the being is presenting what needs to be addressed. And the counselor or practitioner who is looking at that as an interruption of what they're doing is really missing the boat. You need to be comfortable with staying with the being and what their mind, what their spiritual compass is presenting, because they're presenting exactly what needs to be presented, the door that needs to next be opened. And when you do that and you take on, you shift gears, so to speak, from the steps you're doing of resolving the identity to moving on to resolving the attitude that insists that that identity must remain. Okay, and once you resolve that, then you come back up the trail and pick up where you left off to complete resolving the identity, because it's the only way it's going to work. If you try to steamroller over what that person is presenting, their protest or resistance to that step you're doing of resolving the identity, it's just not going to go well, because you're not staying with them. You're not staying with the material that is what holds the identity there, or whatever it may be. You can be processing a stubbornly held protective attitude, and it brings up on one of the steps, it can easily happen. It arises that there's a moment of shock there. As a practitioner, you need to become empathic and attuned, telepathic, if you will, just present enough to feel the energy that is the feeling of a moment of shock, because it's a very intense feeling. You can feel in that person a sort of rigidness. I can't deal with this. This is too much for me, kind of a very strong, intense feeling that is the energy of a moment of shock. So that's part of your work, is to be aware and notice the energies that are being presented, the spiritual architectures, the mental mechanisms that are arising, so that you can really just be in the flow of the session, which means to be in the flow of the being you're dealing with and what that soul, what that spirit is presenting, and saying, here's the next door to be opened on the trail that we are on. The flow of the session. You cannot be so in love with or dependent on or married to your script for whatever procedure you're on that your function or focus becomes to complete your steps. Your function or focus is to stay with the being, to be in the flow of what they're presenting, to be with them. That is what you're there for. I hope that clarifies that for you. For you as somebody who would be a practitioner, to understand that you cannot give so much attention to what step you're on. It's the being in front of you, the feelings that they're expressing and emanating, and what's coming up for them. And it's always wonderful how easily this works. Everything they express, it's just beautiful. It's just exactly what they need to process what they need to process. And it's exactly what you need to have happen, to have success, for your client to have success in that session. You know, as I said long ago, you know, sometimes it's a matter of not getting in your own way. Staying in the flow of the session, staying with the being, with the person you're working with. Just relax and be with them. And it becomes the easiest thing in the world, and getting wonderful results becomes the easiest thing in the world. You can't be dependent on forms and structures and procedures. You've got to be willing to actually be present, be there with the being. You don't need anything to supersede that, and you'll be just fine, and your clients will love you. Stay in the flow with the being. Just stay in the flow of the session.